Hi, I'm Elena. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how my mother slapped me across the face at my sister's engagement party because the soup I made had no salt. My entire extended family watched in silence. My sister laughed. My father nodded in approval. 5 years later, that same sister walked into my Michelin-starred restaurant and begged me for a job. My mother called crying, asking if I could help them avoid bankruptcy. My father, the man who told me I would never amount to anything, asked if he could invest in my culinary empire. I smiled and said 3 words that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Martinez, and for the first 24 years of my life, I believed that my worth was determined by how well I could please my family. I grew up in a traditional household where family reputation meant everything, where daughters were expected to be graceful, obedient, and most importantly, supportive of their brothers and sisters without complaint or ambition of their own. My older sister Victoria was 3 years my senior, and from the time we were children, she occupied a special place in our family hierarchy. She was beautiful in the conventional way that our parents valued, with perfectly styled hair, an instinct for fashion, and a personality that sparkled at social gatherings. She had married well to a man named Christopher Ashford, whose family owned a successful import-export business. Together, they represented everything my parents had worked toward: the achievement of social standing and financial security through strategic relationship building. I, on the other hand, was the practical daughter, the one who helped in the kitchen during family gatherings, while Victoria entertained guests in the living room. The one who ran errands and managed logistics while Victoria received compliments on her appearance and charm. The one who worked quietly behind the scenes while Victoria basked in the spotlight that our parents so willingly directed toward her. My parents owned a successful catering company called Martinez Family Catering, which they had built over 25 years from a small operation serving local events to a well-established business handling corporate functions, weddings, and high-end private parties throughout the region. The business had provided our family with comfortable middle-class stability, though my parents always felt they existed on the margins of the truly wealthy clients they served, looking in at a world of privilege they could approach but never quite enter. From the age of 12, I had worked in the family business. I started by washing dishes and preparing vegetables, eventually learning every aspect of catering operations from menu planning to execution. By the time I was in high school, I could manage an entire event from start to finish, coordinating timing, supervising presentation, and ensuring that every detail met our standards. I had a natural talent for cooking and an intuitive understanding of how flavors work together, though my parents viewed these abilities as useful skills rather than potential for something greater. When I graduated from high school, there was never any question about what I would do next. I enrolled in the local community college to study business administration, a practical choice that would help me contribute more effectively to the family company. I took classes during the day and worked events on evenings and weekends, maintaining a schedule that left little room for social life or personal exploration. This was simply what was expected, and I accepted it without serious question because I had been raised to believe that family obligation superseded individual desire. Victoria, by contrast, had attended a prestigious private university where she studied communications and met Christopher. She had never shown interest in the catering business beyond occasionally appearing at major events to schmooze with wealthy clients, leveraging her social skills to generate goodwill that my parents could convert into future bookings. She contributed nothing to the actual work of running the business, yet somehow her peripheral involvement was celebrated, while my central role was taken for granted. After I completed my associate degree, I transitioned to working full-time in the family business as the operations manager. My father maintained the title of owner and primary decision-maker, while my mother handled client relationships and bookings. I managed everything else, from vendor relationships to staff scheduling to quality control. I worked 60 to 70 hours per week, often staying up late to prep for next-day events or handling emergencies when equipment failed or staff called in sick. The compensation for this work was minimal. My parents paid me a modest salary that was significantly below market rate for someone with my responsibilities, justifying the low pay by noting that I lived at home and that eventually, I would inherit a share of the business. The arrangement kept me financially dependent while extracting maximum value from my labor, though I did not think of it in these terms at the time. I simply accepted it as the natural order of family dynamics. For years, I had harbored a quiet dream that I barely acknowledged even to myself. I wanted to attend culinary school and learn haute cuisine, to study under master chefs and understand food at a level that went beyond the competent but predictable catering fare we produced. I collected cookbooks and watched cooking shows late at night, absorbing techniques and flavor combinations that fascinated me. I experimented in the margins of my work, occasionally suggesting menu innovations that were almost always rejected as too risky or too expensive for our clientele. My parents' attitude toward my suggestions ranged from dismissive to actively hostile. They had built their business on reliability and familiar crowd pleasers, and they saw no reason to deviate from what had worked for decades. When I proposed adding more contemporary dishes or using higher quality ingredients that would allow us to charge premium prices, my father would wave off the ideas as impractical fantasy. My mother would remind me that our clients wanted traditional comfort food, not experimental cuisine that might confuse or alienate them. The tension between my growing culinary ambitions and my family's rigid conservatism had been building for years, creating a pressure that I mostly kept contained through sheer force of will and the habits of obedience that had been instilled since childhood. I told myself that there would be time later to pursue my dreams, that I needed to be patient and wait for the right moment. I convinced myself that loyalty and duty were more important than personal fulfillment, that wanting more for myself was somehow selfish or ungrateful, given everything my parents had provided. Then came the engagement party that would shatter this carefully maintained fiction and force me to confront truths I had been avoiding for years. Victoria and Christopher had been married for 3 years when they announced they were renewing their vows in an elaborate ceremony, a celebration that Victoria framed as a recommitment but which everyone understood was primarily an opportunity for her to be the center of attention again, and to upgrade from her original wedding to something more extravagant. My parents were thrilled by this announcement, and immediately began planning an engagement party that would serve as the opening act to months of wedding-related celebrations. The party was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late April, to be held at my parents' home with approximately 60 guests from both families and their social circle. As the family's de facto event manager, I was responsible for planning and executing every aspect of the gathering, from menu design to setup to service. Victoria contributed by selecting the color scheme and approving the guest list, treating the planning process as if she were a client rather than family. I spent 2 weeks preparing for the party, working late into the night after completing my regular catering obligations. I designed a menu that I hoped would showcase my capabilities, while remaining within the bounds of what my parents considered appropriate. The centerpiece was to be a French onion soup, a classic dish that I had perfected over months of experimentation, achieving a rich depth of flavor through careful caramelization, and a perfectly balanced broth that I had been aging and refining. The soup was important to me for reasons that went beyond the party itself. It represented my attempt to bridge the gap between my family's traditional expectations and my own culinary aspirations. It was a familiar, crowd-pleasing dish executed at a level that I hoped would make my parents see that I was capable of more than they had been allowing me to do. I had invested tremendous care in every element, from sourcing the highest quality Gruyere cheese to crafting individual croques that would be broiled to perfection just before serving. The day of the party arrived with the usual chaos of event preparation. I had been awake since 4 in the morning, preparing components and coordinating the setup. By early afternoon, the house was transformed, tables arranged and decorated, serving stations prepared, and the kitchen operating like a well-oiled machine under my direction. I had hired 2 assistants from our regular catering staff to help with service, though I planned to handle the critical cooking myself. Victoria spent the day getting her hair and makeup done, emerging in the late afternoon looking radiant and ready to receive the admiration she considered her due. My mother fussed over last-minute details of decoration while my father greeted early arriving guests, both of them beaming with pride over Victoria's picture-perfect life and this celebration of her fairy-tale marriage. I remained in the kitchen, orchestrating the timing of multiple dishes, ensuring that everything would be ready to serve at the proper temperature and in the correct sequence. The soup was my particular focus, and I tasted it multiple times throughout the afternoon, adjusting and perfecting until it achieved exactly the complex, savory depth I had been working toward. The flavor was extraordinarily rich and nuanced, The kind of soup that would make people pause and really taste what they were eating rather than simply consuming it mindlessly. As guests arrived and the party reached its full energy, I began the final preparations for the first course. The soup was already portioned into individual serving crocks, the cheese grated and ready to be applied, the broiler preheated to the precise temperature needed to create that perfect golden brown crust. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and I felt a rare sense of pride in what I had created. The moment came to serve the soup. My assistants carried the crocks out on trays, placing them before the seated guests with practiced efficiency. I watched from the kitchen doorway as people received their servings, eager to see their reactions to what I considered my finest work. The dining room was filled with the warm sounds of conversation and laughter, the atmosphere exactly what such gatherings were meant to create. Then I heard my mother's voice rise above the ambient noise, sharp and angry in a way that immediately silenced nearby conversations. She was holding her soup spoon in the air, her face contorted with an expression of disgust and outrage that seemed wildly disproportionate to anything that could possibly be wrong with food. She called my name, not with the tone of someone asking a question, but with the commanding sharpness of someone summoning a servant who had committed an offense. Every head in the room turned toward her, then swiveled to find me standing in the kitchen doorway. The conversation died completely, replaced by the kind of terrible silence that precedes public humiliation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I walked into the dining room, my heart beginning to race though I did not yet understand what was happening. My mother's face was flushed with anger, and my father beside her wore an expression of grim disapproval. Victoria was watching with poorly concealed anticipation, as if she sensed that something entertaining was about to occur at my expense. My mother's words came out in a hiss that was somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. She demanded to know how I could serve such food to guests, how I could embarrass the family with such incompetence, how I could possibly call myself a cook when I could not even properly salt a simple soup. She held up her spoon as if it were evidence of a crime, and around the room, other guests began tentatively tasting their own servings, their faces showing confusion as they tried to understand what the problem was. I stood there frozen, genuinely bewildered because I had tasted that soup dozens of times over the past hours, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was properly seasoned. The flavor was complex and layered, the salt level carefully calibrated to enhance rather than overpower. There was no possibility that I had somehow forgotten to season it or made some basic error that a first-year culinary student would catch. I tried to explain this, my voice coming out smaller than I intended as I suggested that perhaps my mother had received a serving from a different batch, that there must be some explanation because I had tasted the soup immediately before service and it had been perfect. My words sounded defensive even to my own ears, and I could see from the faces around the room that people interpreted my explanation as making excuses rather than stating facts. My father stood then, his considerable presence commanding attention. He did not raise his voice, which somehow made his words more cutting. He said that I had always been careless, that I thought I was too good for simple family cooking, that I was trying to show off with fancy techniques when I could not even master the basics. He said that this was exactly why he had never trusted me with more responsibility, why he had been right to keep me in a subordinate role despite my constant pushing for more authority. The shame that flooded through me in that moment was almost physical in its intensity. I felt my face burning, felt the weight of 60 pairs of eyes observing my humiliation, felt the crushing sense of being exposed as a fraud in front of everyone who mattered in my family's social world. I wanted to defend myself, to insist that I had done nothing wrong, but the words would not come. I had been trained too thoroughly to defer to my parents' judgment, to accept their assessment of my worth and capabilities. Victoria chose that moment to speak, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she suggested that perhaps cooking was simply not my strength, that some people were meant to do creative work while others were better suited to simple execution. She said this with a smile, as if she were being kind, but the cruelty underneath was evident to anyone paying attention. Several of her friends laughed, a sound that cut through me like broken glass. I stood there, trembling, fighting back tears that I absolutely could not allow to fall in front of this audience. I apologized, the words automatic and hollow, promising to bring out a different course immediately, to fix this disaster that I still did not understand. I turned to go back to the kitchen, desperate to escape the scrutiny and the shame, to hide in the familiar safety of work. That was when my mother stood and walked toward me. I thought perhaps she was going to speak to me privately, to deliver additional criticism away from the crowd. Instead, she raised her hand and slapped me across the face with enough force that my head snapped to the side and the sound echoed through the silent room. The shock was so complete that for a moment I could not process what had happened. The physical pain was secondary to the psychological impact of being struck in front of 60 people, of being treated like a misbehaving child rather than a 24-year-old adult who had dedicated years of her life to supporting this family and their business. I stood there with my hand rising slowly to my burning cheek, staring at my mother's angry face, unable to formulate thoughts or words. My father's voice came from behind her, calm and approving, saying that perhaps now I would take things seriously, that perhaps this would teach me not to waste people's time with my pretensions. Victoria laughed, an actual laugh of delight at my humiliation, and several guests joined in with nervous chuckles that suggested they were uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge what had just occurred. Something broke inside me in that moment. Not loudly or dramatically, but quietly and completely. The structure of belief that had supported my entire life. The conviction that family loyalty was paramount, and that my parents' judgment was trustworthy, shattered like glass under pressure. I looked at my mother's self-righteous anger, at my father's approval of my public humiliation, at my sister's gleeful enjoyment of my pain, and I saw them clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. They did not love me. Not in any meaningful sense. They valued my labor and my obedience, but they had no respect for me as a person, no interest in my growth or happiness, no capacity to see me as anything other than a supporting character in Victoria's starring role. Everything I had told myself about family bonds and eventual recognition had been a comforting fiction that allowed me to tolerate the intolerable. I did not cry. I did not argue or defend myself or try to explain one more time that the soup had been perfectly seasoned when I served it. I simply stood there for a long moment, feeling that slap echo through my entire understanding of who I was, and who I wanted to become. Then I walked back to the kitchen, removed my apron, collected my purse and car keys, and walked out the back door without saying a word to anyone. Behind me, I heard my mother calling after me, her voice angry rather than concerned, demanding to know where I thought I was going when there was still food to be served and guests to be managed. I heard Victoria's voice saying something I could not make out, followed by more laughter. I heard the rising buzz of conversation as 60 people began discussing what they had just witnessed. I got into my car and drove. I had no destination in mind, only the overwhelming need to put distance between myself and that house, that family, that life I had been living without truly examining whether it was the life I wanted. I drove for hours through the dark streets, my mind simultaneously racing and completely blank, processing and refusing to process what had just happened. Around midnight, I found myself parked outside a small cafe that I had driven past hundreds of times but never entered. Through the window, I could see a few customers lingering over late-night coffee and pastries, the warm light and quiet atmosphere offering a sharp contrast to the chaos and humiliation I had just escaped. On impulse, I went inside and ordered coffee, sitting at a corner table where I could be alone with my thoughts. The server who brought my coffee was a young woman about my age, and she looked at my face with concern, probably noticing the red mark that was undoubtedly still visible on my cheek. She asked if I was okay, and something about the genuine kindness in her voice made the tears I had been holding back finally break through. I cried silently into my napkin while this stranger brought me water and told me to take my time, that the cafe was open all night and I could stay as long as I needed. When I finally composed myself enough to speak, I found myself telling her everything. About the soup and the slap and the years of subordination and the dreams I had been too afraid to pursue. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of sympathy, and when I finished, she said something that would stay with me forever. She said that some people will never see your worth, and waiting for them to recognize it is like waiting for the sun to rise in the west. She said that the moment you realize you are waiting for something that will never come is actually a gift, because it frees you to stop waiting and start building. She said that she had left her own family 2 years ago to pursue music against their wishes, and while the first year had been terrifying and difficult, she would rather struggle towards something she believed in than succeed at something that killed her spirit. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, and when I finally left that cafe, I had made a decision. I was not going back to my parents' house. I was not going to apologize or try to smooth things over or resume my role as if nothing had happened. I was going to take the money I had been saving secretly for the past 2 years, money that my parents did not know about from occasional side catering jobs I had done independently, and I was going to use it to pursue the dream I had been too afraid to claim. I was going to culinary school. And after that, I was going to build something that was entirely mine, something that reflected my vision and my values, something that no one could take away or diminish or claim credit for. I was going to prove that the person my family saw when they looked at me was not who I actually was or who I could become. That night, sitting in my car outside the cafe as the first light of dawn began to color the sky, I felt simultaneously terrified and more alive than I had felt in years. I had no safety net, no family support, and no guarantee that I would succeed. But I had something more important. I had clarity about who I no longer wanted to be and the first glimmerings of who I might become. The real journey was just beginning, and it would be harder and more rewarding than anything I had experienced before. The morning after the engagement party, I woke up in a budget motel room with sunlight streaming through thin curtains, and the absolute certainty that my old life was over. I had driven there in the early hours of dawn after leaving the cafe, paying cash for a week's stay because I could not bring myself to return to my parents' house even to collect my belongings. Everything I owned was still in that house. Everything except my purse, my car, and the secret savings account that represented 2 years of side work and careful financial discipline. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and took inventory of my situation with the kind of brutal honesty that only becomes possible after your entire worldview has collapsed. I had approximately $11,000 in savings, money I had earned by taking private catering jobs on my rare days off and weekends when my parents thought I was running errands or visiting friends. I had my car, which was old but reliable, paid off years ago and registered in my name. I had my phone, though I had already silenced it after receiving dozens of angry calls and texts from my mother demanding that I return home immediately and stop being dramatic. What I did not have was nearly as significant as what I did have. I did not have a place to live beyond this motel room. I did not have most of my clothes, my kitchen equipment, my books, or any of the personal possessions that had accumulated over 24 years. I did not have a job, having effectively abandoned my position at the family catering business when I walked out during the party. I did not have family support or the social network that had been built around my parents' business connections. I had cut myself free from everything familiar, and now I was floating in open water with no clear destination. The fear that washed over me in that moment was profound and physical. My hands shook as I held my phone, scrolling through the angry messages from my mother that alternated between fury at my abandonment and dismissive certainty that I would come crawling back within days. There was nothing from my father, which somehow hurt more than my mother's rage. Victoria had sent a single message saying that I had always been unstable, and that my dramatic exit had ruined her party, but that everyone had rallied and enjoyed the rest of the evening despite my selfishness. Even in crisis, Victoria could only see events through the lens of how they affected her. I could have gone back. That option remained available, at least for the moment. I could apologize, accept whatever punishment my parents deemed appropriate, resume my position at the catering company, and return to the life I had been living. It would be humiliating, but it would be safe. I would have a place to sleep and steady income and the dubious comfort of familiar patterns, even if those patterns were slowly destroying me. The thought of returning made me physically ill. I realized that I would rather face complete uncertainty than go back to that house and that life. Whatever happened next, it had to be forward motion rather than retreat. I had to believe that the voice inside me that insisted I was capable of more than servitude was telling the truth, even if I had no evidence yet to support that belief. I spent that first day in practical survival mode, addressing immediate necessities before I could begin thinking about larger plans. I drove to a storage facility and rented the smallest unit available, a 5x5 space that would hold whatever possessions I could retrieve from my parents' house. Then I called my former roommate from community college, a woman named Jessica who had moved to the city to work in marketing, and whom I had stayed in occasional contact with despite my limited social life. Jessica answered on the second ring, and when I explained my situation in the briefest possible terms, she did not hesitate. She said I could stay on her couch for as long as I needed, that she had been in a similar situation 2 years earlier when she had left an abusive relationship, and that she understood what it meant to restart your life from nothing. Her immediate, unconditional support was so unexpected after years of conditional family relationships that I found myself crying again, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of someone offering help without demands or judgment attached. The next challenge was retrieving my belongings from my parents' house. I could not simply show up and pack while they were home, as that would inevitably lead to confrontation, manipulation, or possibly physical prevention of my leaving. I needed to go when they would be absent, which meant during one of their catering events. I checked the company calendar that I still had access to through my phone and identified a wedding they were catering that coming Saturday, an all-day event that would keep both my parents occupied from early morning through late evening. The days between my decision and Saturday moved with agonizing slowness. I stayed at Jessica's apartment, sleeping on her couch and trying to formulate some kind of plan for what would come next. Jessica worked long hours at her marketing firm, so I had substantial time alone to think, research, and begin mapping out a path forward. I started by researching culinary schools, not the local community programs I had previously considered as unrealistic fantasies, but serious institutions that could provide the training and credentials I would need to pursue my vision. The top programs were expensive, with tuition running $30,000 to $50,000 for comprehensive courses, but they also had strong job placement rates and alumni networks that could provide opportunities after graduation. I filled out preliminary applications to 3 schools, knowing that acceptance was far from guaranteed, and that financing would be a significant challenge even if I was accepted. I also began researching the restaurant industry more broadly, reading everything I could find about successful chefs who had built their own establishments, studying their backgrounds and approaches, learning about the economic realities of restaurant ownership. The statistics were sobering. The majority of new restaurants failed within their first year, and even successful establishments operated on razor-thin profit margins that left little room for error. The path I was contemplating was extraordinarily difficult, with failure far more likely than success. Yet the more I read about the challenges, the more determined I became. I was not approaching this as a romantic fantasy or an escape from difficulty into ease. I was choosing a different kind of difficulty, one that I would own completely rather than one imposed by others' expectations and limitations. The restaurant industry would test me in ways I could not yet imagine, but those tests would reveal my actual capabilities, rather than simply confirming someone else's predetermined assessment of my worth. On Saturday morning, I drove to my parents' house with Jessica accompanying me for moral support and assistance. We arrived at 8 o'clock, after confirming through a casual text to one of the catering staff that my parents had left for the wedding venue an hour earlier. The house was empty and silent, filled with the familiar smells and sights that had defined my entire life until a week ago. Walking through those rooms felt surreal and sad. I moved quickly through the space, gathering clothes, personal items, books, and the kitchen equipment I had purchased with my own money over the years. Jessica helped me pack everything into boxes and load them into both our cars, working with efficient purpose that kept me focused on the task, rather than the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. In my bedroom, I found a note my mother had left on my pillow, presumably placed there at some point during the week. The note was brief and cold. It said that I had always been ungrateful and difficult, that I had embarrassed the family with my dramatic behavior, and that I was welcome to return only if I was prepared to apologize sincerely and accept that my parents knew what was best for me. There was no acknowledgement that slapping me in front of 60 people might have been wrong, no recognition of the years I had worked for minimal compensation, no curiosity about why I had felt compelled to leave. It was purely about my failure to conform and my obligation to submit. I left the note on the pillow and walked out of that room for the last time. We finished loading the cars within 2 hours, taking everything I cared about, and leaving behind the furniture and larger items that belonged to the house rather than to me. As we drove away, I looked back once at the building that had been my home, feeling a complex mixture of grief and liberation. I was mourning not what I was actually losing but what I had hoped that family could have been if they had been different people or if I had been the daughter they wanted. Over the following weeks, I fell into a new routine that was simultaneously exhausting and energizing. I found work at a small Italian restaurant called Bellinate, starting as a prep cook at an hourly wage that was modest but significantly more than my parents had paid me. The chef owner, a man named Antonio Russo who had immigrated from Naples 30 years earlier, hired me after a brief working interview where I demonstrated my knife skills and general kitchen competence. Antonio was gruff and demanding, but his criticism was based on legitimate standards rather than arbitrary judgment or personal animosity. When he corrected my technique, he explained why the correct method was better. When he praised work that met his standards, the approval was genuine and specific. Working under him, I began to understand the difference between high standards that elevate everyone and impossible expectations that serve only to maintain hierarchy and control. The restaurant was small, seating perhaps 40 people, but it had a loyal following built on Antonio's commitment to authentic preparation and quality ingredients. I watched how he interacted with regular customers, how he adapted dishes to accommodate preferences without compromising his core principles, how he managed his small staff with clear expectations and genuine respect for their contributions. He was showing me, through example rather than instruction, what leadership in a kitchen could look like when it was based on shared purpose rather than domination. During my shifts at Bellinate, I absorbed everything I could. I learned traditional Italian techniques that went far beyond the basic competence I had developed at my family's catering business. I discovered how to make fresh pasta by hand, achieving the right texture through feel rather than measurement. I studied the subtle variations in regional Italian cuisine, understanding how the same dish could be prepared differently in Rome versus Sicily versus Naples. I experimented with flavor combinations during family meal preparation, when Antonio encouraged his staff to be creative with leftover ingredients. On my days off, I continued researching culinary schools and working on applications. The application process was more complex than I had anticipated, requiring essays about my culinary philosophy and goals, letters of recommendation that were difficult to obtain given my limited professional network, and portfolio materials demonstrating my skills and creativity. I worked on these applications late into the night at Jessica's apartment, crafting and refining my essays until they accurately conveyed both my passion and my seriousness of purpose. I also began saving money with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I lived as cheaply as possible, spending almost nothing beyond absolute necessities, depositing every spare dollar into my savings account. Jessica charged me minimal rent, far below market rate, but I insisted on contributing what I could to groceries and utilities. I calculated constantly, projecting how long it would take to save enough for culinary school tuition, if I was not accepted to a program with scholarship assistance, how much I would need as a safety net to survive the intensive months of full-time study. 3 months after leaving my parents' house, I received my first acceptance letter. The Culinary Institute of America, one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the country, had accepted me into their associate degree program beginning the following semester. The letter included a partial scholarship based on merit and financial need, covering roughly 40% of the tuition. The remaining cost was still substantial, approximately $18,000 that I would need to cover through loans and my savings. I sat in Jessica's apartment holding that acceptance letter and cried tears of relief and fear in equal measure. This was the opportunity one had been dreaming about, the door opening into a future I had barely allowed myself to imagine. It was also a massive financial commitment that would consume my entire savings and require taking on debt that would follow me for years. If I failed or if the culinary career I was pursuing did not materialize, I would be worse off than if I had never tried at all. Jessica came home from work and found me sitting on the couch surrounded by financial calculations and program materials, trying to determine whether accepting this opportunity was brave or reckless. She sat down beside me and asked a simple question that cut through all my analytical paralysis. She asked whether I would regret not going more than I would regret any difficulty that came from trying. The answer was immediate and certain. I would absolutely regret not trying. I had already spent too many years living according to others' limitations and letting fear masquerade as practicality. If I was going to fail, I wanted to fail while attempting something I believed in rather than succeed at something that diminished me. I accepted the position in the program and began making arrangements to attend. The logistics were complicated. The school was located several hours away, which meant I would need to relocate again and find housing in an expensive area with notoriously high costs of living. I would need to quit my job at Bellinate, giving up the steady income and the learning environment that Antonio had provided. I would be taking on significant student loan debt at a time when I had no safety net and no family support to fall back on if things went wrong. When I told Antonio that I was leaving to attend culinary school, I expected him to be annoyed at losing a reliable prep cook on short notice. Instead, he congratulated me warmly and told me that he had wondered how long it would take me to realize I was capable of more than working in someone else's kitchen. He said that he had recognized something in me during that first working interview, a hunger to learn and a natural feel for food that could not be taught. He wrote me a letter of recommendation for future opportunities and told me that if I ever needed advice or support, I should not hesitate to call him. His faith in me, coming from someone who had no obligation to care about my success, meant more than I could adequately express. Antonio represented what mentorship and leadership could look like when they were based on genuine interest in another person's growth, rather than extraction of labor or maintenance of control. He had given me not just skills but also a model for the kind of chef and leader I wanted to become. The month before I left for culinary school passed in a blur of preparation and transition. I found a room to rent in a shared house near the campus, a small space that would cost most of my monthly budget, but would provide basic shelter and proximity to my classes. I sold my car, as I would not need it in the area where the school was located, and could not afford the insurance and maintenance while not earning income. The money from the sale helped offset some of my initial expenses, and gave me a small financial cushion for the first semester. I also finalized my student loans, signing documents that committed me to debt that felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I was borrowing money to invest in myself, to purchase an education and credentials that no one could take away from me. Yet I was also taking on financial obligation that would follow me for years, and that I would need to repay regardless of whether my culinary dreams materialized into sustainable career. Jessica helped me move to my new housing, driving me and my belongings in her car since I no longer had my own vehicle. As we unloaded boxes into the small room that would be my home for the next year, she gave me a gift that I had not expected. It was a high-quality chef's knife, a professional tool that represented a significant investment. She said that everyone needs the right tools to do their best work, and that she believed I was going to do extraordinary things. I had not had contact with my family since the day I moved out of their house. My phone number remained the same, but they had stopped calling or texting after the first few weeks. I had checked the Martinez family catering social media pages occasionally, seeing that they continued operating without any public acknowledgement of my departure. Victoria had posted extensively about her engagement party, sharing professional photos that showed the event looking elegant and successful, with no mention of any incident or disruption. Part of me had expected my parents to eventually reach out, perhaps to offer some kind of reconciliation or at least to verify that I was alive and safe. Their complete silence communicated more clearly than words could have that they considered me to have made my choice, and that they felt no obligation to maintain relationship with a daughter who had rejected their authority. This finality was painful, but it also freed me from the hope that reconciliation might be possible if I just proved myself sufficiently. There was no audience for my achievements, which meant I could pursue them purely for my own reasons rather than to earn approval that would never come. The night before my first day of culinary school, I could not sleep. I lay in my small room listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a new city, feeling simultaneously more alone than I had ever been and more hopeful about the future. I thought about the path that had led me here, from that slap at the engagement party to this moment of beginning something entirely new. I thought about all the ways I could fail and all the possibilities that existed if I succeeded. Most of all, I thought about the Elena who had stood in her parents' kitchen making soup that she knew was perfect, absorbing criticism she knew was unfair, accepting treatment she knew was wrong because she had been taught that family loyalty required accepting whatever family demanded. That Elena felt like a different person, someone I had been but no longer was. The Elena I was becoming did not yet have a clear form or definition, but she was someone who believed that her judgment and abilities had value, someone who was willing to risk everything for the chance to discover her actual potential, someone who understood that sometimes walking away from everything familiar is the only path to finding out who you really are. I had taken the first steps into the unknown, and there was no going back. The only direction was forward, into whatever challenges and opportunities awaited me at culinary school and beyond. I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, carrying nothing but my skills, my determination, and the hard-won knowledge that I would rather fail on my own terms than succeed on someone else's. The first day at the Culinary Institute of America shattered any romantic notions, I might have harbored about culinary education being an extended cooking class where passionate students created beautiful dishes, while inspiring instructors offered gentle guidance and encouragement. The reality was far more demanding, structured, and unforgiving than anything I had experienced working in my family's catering business or at Antonio's restaurant. I arrived at the main building 30 minutes before the orientation session was scheduled to begin, carrying the new knife kit I had purchased with a portion of my student loan money, and wearing the required chef's uniform that still felt stiff and unfamiliar despite multiple washings intended to soften the fabric. The campus was impressive in a way that simultaneously inspired and intimidated me, with state-of-the-art kitchens visible through large windows, students moving purposefully between buildings, and an atmosphere of serious professional preparation rather than casual academic exploration. The orientation gathered approximately 60 incoming students in a large lecture hall, all of us wearing identical chef's whites and expressions of nervous anticipation. We represented diverse backgrounds and ages, from recent high school graduates to career changers in their 40s, united by the decision to pursue culinary arts at a level that demanded complete commitment. The program director who addressed us made the expectations clear from the opening remarks. The curriculum would be intensive and unrelenting. The standards would be professional rather than educational, meaning that work judged inadequate in a restaurant kitchen would be judged inadequate here regardless of effort or improvement from previous baseline. Approximately 20% of students who began the program would not complete it, either because they could not maintain the required academic standards, or because they discovered that the reality of culinary careers did not match their expectations. This frank acknowledgement of the difficulty ahead had a clarifying effect on me. I had not come here seeking an easy path or comfortable validation. I had come to be tested and trained at the highest level I could access, to discover whether my passion for cooking could translate into professional excellence, to develop skills that would allow me to build something significant on my own terms. The difficulty was not an obstacle to overcome, but rather the necessary condition for the transformation I was seeking. The program structure became immediately apparent during that first week. We would rotate through different kitchen stations and culinary disciplines in intensive blocks, learning fundamental techniques in each area before progressing to more complex applications. The days were long and physically demanding, beginning with early morning prep work and extending through afternoon practical sessions and evening lectures on food science, nutrition, sanitation, and business operations. The volume of information delivered each day was overwhelming, requiring hours of study and practice beyond scheduled class time, simply to maintain competence. My first rotation was in classical French technique, overseen by Chef Marchand, a woman who had trained in Lyon and worked in Michelin-starred restaurants for 15 years before transitioning to culinary education. She was exacting in ways that made Antonio seem permissive by comparison, correcting knife angles within millimeters and rejecting entire batches of prep work that failed to meet her standards for uniformity and precision. Her criticism was never personal or cruel, but it was relentless and specific, identifying every deviation from correct technique and every lapse in attention to detail. During those first weeks under Chef Marchand's instruction, I discovered muscles in my hands and forearms that I had not known existed, each one protesting the repetitive motions required to achieve proper knife technique. I learned that the casual competence I had developed through years of home cooking and catering work was superficial compared to the precision required at professional levels. I could chop an onion adequately for soup preparation, but I could not initially produce the perfect brunoise dice that Chef Marchand demanded, with each tiny cube measuring exactly 3 millimeters on all sides and the entire batch showing no variation in size or shape. The learning process was humbling in ways that were simultaneously frustrating and exhilarating. Each time I believed I had mastered a technique, Chef Marchand would identify subtleties I had missed or refinements that separated competent execution from excellent execution. When I finally produced a batch of brunoise that met her standards after 3 weeks of daily practice, the brief nod of approval she offered felt more validating than any elaborate praise could have been. I was learning that genuine mastery required patience and repetition far beyond the point where the work felt tedious, pushing through the plateau where improvement seemed impossible to reach the level where technique became automatic and creative expression became possible. Beyond the technical challenges, culinary school demanded a level of time management and personal discipline that tested my capacity for sustained effort. My typical day began at 5 in the morning, when I woke to review notes and recipe specifications before leaving for campus at 6. Morning classes ran from 7 until noon, with brief breaks that were barely sufficient for consuming the quick meals I had learned to prepare in advance. Afternoon practicals extended until 6 in the evening, followed by lectures and demonstrations that often continued until 9. After returning to my shared housing, I spent 2 to 3 hours studying, practicing knife skills on vegetables I purchased cheaply from a wholesale supplier, and preparing for the following day before finally collapsing into bed around midnight. The financial pressure that accompanied this demanding schedule created constant background stress that affected every decision I made. My student loans covered tuition and basic fees, but living expenses consumed my limited savings at a rate that terrified me whenever I allowed myself to calculate how many weeks remained before my resources would be completely exhausted. I had budgeted carefully, but the reality of living in an expensive area while earning no income meant that unexpected expenses, however minor, created genuine crises that required creative problem-solving. I addressed this financial stress through a combination of extreme frugality and strategic side work that existed in the margins of my schedule. I ate almost exclusively the food provided during culinary classes or simple meals I could prepare quickly and cheaply in the shared kitchen of my housing. I walked everywhere rather than using any form of paid transportation, adding 30 to 40 minutes to my daily commute in each direction. I took on occasional catering gigs on weekends, working events that paid cash and required skills I had developed long before attending culinary school, each job providing just enough money to extend my runway by another week or two. The social dynamics of culinary school added another layer of complexity to the experience. My classmates represented a wide range of backgrounds and motivations, from wealthy students for whom the tuition represented a minor family expenditure to scholarship recipients like myself who were risking everything on the possibility of culinary careers. Some students had extensive restaurant experience and treated culinary school as professional credentialing rather than foundational education. Others had minimal practical experience but had been cooking enthusiastically as serious home cooks for years. A few had come seeking a glamorous career in food media or celebrity chef status, and these students often struggled most with the unglamorous reality of professional cooking. I formed a study group with 3 other students during the second month of the program, recognizing that collaborative learning would allow us to cover more material more effectively than individual study. The group included Marcus, who had worked as a line cook in various restaurants for 6 years before deciding he needed formal training to advance beyond entry-level positions. There was also Priya, a recent college graduate who had studied biology before realizing that her passion lay in pastry rather than laboratory science. The third member was James, a career changer in his mid-30s who had left a corporate finance job to pursue cooking after years of treating it as a serious hobby. These 3 people became not just study partners but genuine friends who understood the particular pressures and challenges of what we were attempting. We quizzed each other on food safety protocols and recipe ratios, practiced techniques together in the campus kitchens during open lab hours, and provided emotional support during the inevitable moments when the difficulty of the program made us question whether we could actually complete it. The friendship that developed among us was strengthened by shared struggle in ways that casual social connections could never match. As the first semester progressed, I began to identify areas where my background and natural abilities gave me advantages, and areas where I struggled compared to classmates with different experience. My years of catering work had developed exceptional organizational skills and an ability to manage multiple tasks simultaneously under time pressure. When we began cooking complete meals within strict time constraints, I excelled at the planning and coordination required to have multiple dishes finished simultaneously at the correct temperature and quality. I could break down a complex menu into component tasks, estimate timing accurately, and adjust on the fly when unexpected issues arose. However, I struggled initially with the creative and aesthetic aspects of plating and presentation. My catering background had emphasized efficiency and volume rather than artistic expression, and I had to work considerably harder than some classmates to develop an eye for color, composition, and the visual storytelling that elevated food from mere sustenance to complete sensory experience. I spent hours studying photographs of beautifully plated dishes, analyzing the principles that made certain compositions work while others fell flat, practicing with cheap ingredients until I began to internalize the aesthetic sensibility that seemed to come naturally to students with backgrounds in visual arts. The midpoint of the first semester brought our first major evaluation, a practical examination where each student had to prepare a 3-course meal from a list of required ingredients within a 4-hour time window. The evaluation would be conducted by a panel of 3 chefs, each grading independently on technique, flavor, presentation, and overall execution. The results of this examination would determine whether students were progressing adequately or needed remedial work to continue in the program. I prepared for this examination with an intensity that bordered on obsession, practicing variations of possible menu combinations every available moment for 2 weeks leading up to the test date. I created detailed timelines for different scenarios, memorized backup plans for potential equipment failures or ingredient issues, and drilled myself on the technical elements most likely to be scrutinized by the evaluating chefs. By the time the examination date arrived, I felt as ready as preparation could make me, though I also understood that execution under pressure often revealed gaps that practice could not fully anticipate. The examination itself was 4 hours of concentrated focus unlike anything I had experienced before. The required ingredients included duck breast, root vegetables, fresh herbs, and a selection of pantry staples that allowed for various preparations. I had decided on a menu that showcased classical technique, while allowing for some personal interpretation. The first course would be a duck confit tranche with pickled vegetables and herb oil, demonstrating my ability to execute a time-intensive preparation that required precision and patience. The main course featured perfectly seared duck breast with a cherry gastrique, roasted root vegetables, and a potato puree that had to achieve restaurant-quality smoothness. The dessert was a chocolate pâte de crème with candied orange peel, a relatively simple preparation that relied on exact technique to achieve proper texture. As I worked through each component of the meal, I felt myself entering a state of complete absorption where nothing existed except the immediate task at hand. The noise of 30 other students working in the same kitchen faded into background static. The awareness of being evaluated disappeared. There was only the duck skin that needed to render slowly to achieve crispy perfection, the potatoes that had to be riced while still hot to prevent guminess, the chocolate that required gentle heating to avoid seizing, the precise moment to plate each element so that temperatures and textures would be optimal when the dishes reached the judges. When the 4 hours expired and I stepped back from my completed plates, I experienced a moment of pure clarity about what I had just created. The food on those plates represented not just the techniques I had learned over the past months, but also everything I had brought with me from years of cooking experience. The tranche showed the organizational skills I had developed managing catering events. The main course demonstrated the classical technique Chef Marchand had drilled into us through countless repetitions. The dessert revealed the attention to flavor balance that Antonio had modeled in his approach to Italian cuisine. Each element was technically correct and properly executed, but together they told a story about who I was as a cook and what I valued in food. The results of the examination were posted 3 days later. I had received scores in the top 15% of the class, with particular commendation for technique and flavor development. One evaluator had noted that my food showed maturity and confidence unusual for a first-semester student, suggesting prior professional experience that had been well integrated with culinary training. Another had commented that my plating needed refinement but showed improvement from earlier work they had observed. The third simply wrote that the food was delicious and properly executed, which was perhaps the highest compliment professional chefs gave to student work. This validation meant more to me than the objective scores themselves. The chefs who had evaluated my work had no investment in my success or failure, no relationship to protect or agenda to advance. They had judged my cooking purely on its merits, and they had found it worthy. This was the opposite of every evaluation I had received from my parents, who had consistently dismissed my abilities regardless of objective evidence. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe fully in the possibility that I might actually have the talent and skills to succeed in professional cooking. The second half of the first semester brought new rotations through different culinary disciplines, each presenting distinct challenges and learning curves. I spent 3 weeks in the pastry kitchen, discovering that baking required a different mindset than cooking, with less room for improvisation and more dependence on precise measurements and controlled conditions. I found pastry work simultaneously frustrating and meditative, appreciating the way that exact technique produced consistent results, but missing the intuitive adjustments that cooking allowed. The butchery rotation tested my physical strength and my comfort with the reality of transforming whole animals into the cuts of meat that appeared sanitized and disconnected from their origins in grocery stores. I learned to break down chickens, pork shoulders, and entire lamb carcasses, developing respect for the animals that died to provide food and understanding the economic importance of using every possible part rather than generating waste. The work was physically demanding and sometimes emotionally difficult, but it was also essential knowledge for anyone serious about professional cooking. By the time the first semester concluded in December, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond mere physical tiredness. The sustained intensity of the program had depleted reserves I had not known I possessed, pushing me to limits that revealed both capabilities and vulnerabilities I had not previously tested. I had lost weight despite eating regularly because the physical demands of kitchen work and the stress of constant evaluation burned calories faster than I could replace them. I had developed new scars on my hands and arms from the inevitable cuts and burns that accompanied professional cooking. I had spent virtually every waking hour either in class, studying, practicing, or working side jobs to maintain my precarious financial position. Yet I had also achieved something I had never achieved before. I had survived 4 months of professional culinary training at one of the most demanding institutions in the country. I had demonstrated to myself and to instructors whose judgment I trusted that I possessed both the technical skills and the mental resilience to succeed in professional kitchens. I had built friendships based on mutual respect and shared struggle rather than proximity and convenience. I had transformed myself from someone who knew how to cook competently into someone who understood cooking as a serious discipline that required continuous learning and refinement. During the 3-week winter break between semesters, I remained in my shared housing rather than traveling anywhere for the holidays. I could not afford the expense of travel, and I had no family to visit even if I had possessed the resources. The house was mostly empty as other residents returned to their families, and I found myself alone in an unfamiliar city during the season that was supposed to be about togetherness and celebration. The solitude of those weeks was profound, but it was not entirely unwelcome. I used the time to rest and recover from the exhaustion of the first semester, sleeping late and allowing my body to heal from the accumulated minor injuries and chronic fatigue that I had been pushing through. I also used the time to work additional catering shifts, taking advantage of the holiday season demand to earn money that would extend my financial runway through the second semester. On Christmas Eve, I found myself working a holiday party for a wealthy family in their elegant home, serving appetizers and managing the kitchen for an event that reminded me painfully of the engagement party where my mother had slapped me 8 months earlier. I watched the family interact with warmth and genuine affection, the parents praising their children and the siblings treating each other with respect and kindness, and I felt the sharp contrast with my own family gatherings where love had always been conditional on compliance. During a quiet moment in the kitchen, I pulled out my phone and looked at the social media profiles of my family members, something I had avoided doing for months. My parents' catering company page showed that they were still operating, posting photos of recent events and promoting their services. Victoria had posted extensively about her holiday celebrations, documenting a Christmas gathering at my parents' house with photographs that showed the family looking prosperous and happy, with no acknowledgement that I had ever existed or that anything was missing from their perfect picture. The absence of any reference to me in their lives stung in a way I had not fully anticipated. 8 months had passed since I had left, and they had apparently closed ranks and moved forward as if I had simply been edited out of the family narrative. There was no indication that they missed me or wondered about my well-being, or felt any responsibility for the circumstances that had led to my departure. I was simply gone, and they had decided that this was acceptable or perhaps even preferable. I put my phone away and returned to work, channeling the complicated emotions into focused energy that made the event run smoothly and earned me a generous tip from the satisfied hosts. Later that night, alone in my room, I made a decision about how I would think about my family going forward. I would stop checking their social media and stop allowing their absence to occupy emotional space that I needed for my own development. They had made their choice to exclude me from their lives, and I would honor that choice by building a life in which their approval or acknowledgement was irrelevant to my sense of worth and accomplishment. This decision brought a sense of peace that had eluded me throughout the months since leaving. I was not forgiving them or excusing their treatment of me. I was simply choosing to stop waiting for something that would never come, and to invest that energy instead in becoming the person I wanted to be. The second semester would begin in 2 weeks, and I would enter it with complete focus on my training and my future rather than on processing pain from my past. I was learning that transformation was not a single dramatic moment, but rather a series of small choices made consistently over time. Each day that I chose to move forward rather than look backward, each time I invested in my skills rather than dwelling on grievances, each moment I defined myself by my actions rather than by others' judgments, I was becoming someone fundamentally different from the person who had stood humiliated in her parents' dining room believing that their assessment of her worth was accurate. The second semester would bring new challenges and opportunities to test whether this emerging version of myself could withstand even greater pressure, and whether my commitment to this path was strong enough to sustain me through the inevitable difficulties ahead. The second semester of culinary school began with a rotation in advanced protein cookery, a discipline that would prove to be both my greatest challenge and the area where I would experience the most significant growth. The instruction was led by Chef Laurent Dubois, a French chef who had earned 2 Michelin stars during his 20-year tenure at a restaurant in Paris before immigrating to the United States and transitioning into culinary education. His reputation among students was formidable, with stories circulating about his exacting standards and his willingness to fail students who demonstrated anything less than complete commitment to excellence. Chef Dubois conducted his first class of the semester with a demonstration that immediately established the level of precision he expected from his students. He prepared a simple roasted chicken, a dish so fundamental that every student in the room had prepared it dozens if not hundreds of times. Yet as we watched him work, it became clear that what we had been doing previously bore only superficial resemblance to what proper technique could achieve. His hands moved with absolute economy of motion, no wasted movement or hesitation, each action purposeful and exact. The way he trussed the bird created perfect symmetry that would ensure even cooking. The temperature he selected and the timing he employed were calibrated to produce skin that shattered like glass while keeping the breast meat impossibly moist, and the thigh meat cooked through without being dry. When he plated the carved chicken and we tasted samples of his work, the difference between competent cooking and masterful cooking became undeniable. This was not merely a well-prepared chicken but rather an expression of decades of refinement, every variable optimized, every detail considered. The experience was simultaneously inspiring and humbling, showing us exactly how much distance remained between our current abilities and the level we were aspiring to reach. Chef Dubois made his expectations clear in language that was direct and unambiguous. He would accept nothing less than our complete effort and attention. Technical errors that resulted from carelessness or insufficient preparation would not be tolerated. We would be cooking expensive proteins, and waste resulting from poor technique would be considered both a practical failure and an ethical failure given the sacrifice of the animals that had died to provide our education. Each student would be responsible for sourcing, preparing, and presenting multiple dishes each week, all of which would be evaluated not just for correctness, but for the level of care and mastery they demonstrated. The workload that accompanied this rotation was substantially heavier than anything I had experienced in the first semester. I found myself spending every available hour either in the teaching kitchens or in the open practice labs, working through techniques repeatedly until muscle memory began to form. I learned to butcher whole fish, removing bones with tweezers to ensure that no diner would ever encounter the unpleasant surprise of a pin bone in their carefully prepared fillet. I practiced cooking steaks to precise temperatures without relying on thermometers, developing the tactile sense that allowed professional cooks to judge doneness through touch and experience, rather than instruments. The financial pressure that had been manageable during the first semester intensified during this rotation because of the cost of ingredients required for practice. The school provided proteins for class work, but developing mastery required additional practice beyond scheduled hours, and those ingredients came from my own limited resources. I found myself making difficult calculations about how many times I could afford to practice a particular technique before the examination where I would need to demonstrate it, balancing the need for repetition against the reality of my dwindling savings. I addressed this challenge through a combination of strategies that required creativity and hustle. I developed a relationship with a local fishmonger who allowed me to purchase fish heads and trim at minimal cost, providing material for stock and practice with delicate bone removal. I connected with a butcher who saved me odd cuts and secondary pieces that restaurants rarely ordered, giving me proteins to work with at prices I could afford. I took on additional weekend catering work, sacrificing sleep and study time to earn money that immediately went toward purchasing the ingredients needed for practice. My study group from the first semester remained intact, and we began pooling resources to share the cost of practice ingredients. Marcus would purchase a whole lamb, and we would gather to break it down together, each of us practicing the butchery while dividing the resulting cuts to take home for further preparation. Priya would buy bulk quantities of cream and eggs for pastry work, and we would share the costs while each working on our individual projects. James had more financial resources than the rest of us, and he generously subsidized some of our practice sessions, understanding that the group's collective learning benefited everyone even when he bore a disproportionate share of the cost. During this rotation, I began to develop a reputation among the instructors for reliability and quiet competence. I was not the most naturally talented student in the program, nor was I the most creative or the most technically precise. However, I showed up consistently, I prepared thoroughly, and I executed with a level of care that reflected genuine respect for the ingredients and the craft. Chef Dubois noticed this consistency and began giving me additional challenges, inviting me to stay after class to observe advanced preparations, or to assist him with special projects that pushed my skills beyond the standard curriculum. One such project involved preparing a multi-course tasting menu for a fundraising dinner that would be attended by major donors to the Culinary Institute. Chef Dubois selected 6 students to work with him on this dinner, and I was honored and terrified to be included in that group. The preparation required us to work at a level of precision and speed that simulated actual Michelin-starred restaurant service, with no margin for error and no possibility of serving anything that was not absolutely perfect. We spent 2 weeks preparing for that dinner, practicing each dish until we could execute it flawlessly under pressure. I was assigned responsibility for preparing a seared scallop course with a cauliflower puree, brown butter, and crispy capers. The dish appeared simple but required absolute mastery of timing and technique. The scallops had to be dried completely and seared in a blazing hot pan to develop a caramelized crust, while keeping the interior barely cooked through. The puree needed to be impossibly smooth, achieved through careful cooking and blending of the cauliflower with just enough cream to create a silky texture. The brown butter had to be cooked to the precise moment when the milk solids turned nutty and fragrant without crossing into burnt. The capers had to be fried until crispy but not bitter. The night of the dinner arrived with a level of pressure I had never experienced before. We were cooking for guests who had paid substantial sums to support the institute, and who had expectations calibrated by experiences at the finest restaurants in the world. Any mistake would be immediately apparent to this sophisticated audience, and any failure would reflect not just on me individually but on Chef Dubois and the entire culinary program. As service began and the first orders came into the kitchen, I felt the familiar sensation of time simultaneously compressing and expanding. Each scallop required my complete attention for the 90 seconds it spent in the pan, yet dozens of scallops needed to be cooked over the course of the evening, each one identical in its perfect execution. I moved through the repetitions in a state of focused calm, monitoring temperature, adjusting timing based on the size of each scallop, plating with the precision that Chef Dubois had drilled into us. When service ended and the final plates had been sent out, Chef Dubois gathered the student team in the kitchen for a brief assessment. He noted areas where our execution had been less than perfect, moments where timing had slipped, or where plating had shown minor inconsistencies. Then he said something that I would remember for the rest of my career. He said that competent cooks could prepare good food when circumstances were favorable, but excellent cooks could prepare excellent food regardless of circumstances. He said that we had performed under genuine pressure tonight, and we had proven that we possessed the mental discipline and technical skill to work at professional levels. This validation from someone whose standards were uncompromising meant more to me than any grade or formal evaluation could have meant. Chef Dubois was not offering empty encouragement or inflated praise. He was making a professional judgment based on objective performance, and his assessment was that I had demonstrated capability worthy of respect. I was beginning to understand that the approval I had spent years seeking from my parents had been valuable only because I had believed their judgment was accurate and important. Chef Dubois's approval was valuable because I respected his standards and trusted his assessment to be honest and informed. As the second semester progressed, I began to notice changes in myself that went beyond culinary skills. I was developing a different relationship with failure and criticism that allowed me to learn from mistakes, rather than being paralyzed by them. When Chef Dubois corrected my technique or rejected a dish as inadequate, I no longer heard those criticisms as judgments of my fundamental worth. Instead, I heard them as information about the gap between my current performance and the standard I was working toward. This shift in perspective transformed criticism from something to be feared and avoided into something to be sought out and utilized. I was also developing a clearer sense of my own judgment and taste, learning to evaluate my work critically without waiting for external validation. I could taste a dish I had prepared and identify what was working and what needed adjustment, trusting my own palate and understanding rather than requiring someone else to tell me whether the food was good. This growing confidence in my own assessment was crucial because professional cooking required making hundreds of small decisions in real time, with no opportunity to seek consensus or external approval before committing to a course of action. The second semester also brought opportunities to explore areas of personal interest within the broader curriculum. I became fascinated with the intersection of traditional techniques and modern applications, studying how classical preparations could be reinterpreted through contemporary understanding of flavor and texture. I spent hours in the library researching historical recipes and comparing them with modern approaches, looking for ways to honor culinary traditions while pushing them forward into new expressions. This research led me to develop a personal project that I pursued in the margins of my required coursework. I began creating a portfolio of dishes that told a story about my own background and influences, drawing on the traditional recipes I had learned growing up in a family catering business, incorporating the classical French techniques I was mastering at culinary school, and adding contemporary elements that reflected my own aesthetic sensibility. Each dish in this portfolio represented a chapter in my culinary journey, a way of documenting my evolution from competent caterer to serious chef. One dish in particular became a signature that I would continue to refine for years. It was a deconstructed version of the French onion soup that had been served at Victoria's engagement party, the dish that had indirectly triggered my departure from my family. I took the fundamental elements of that classic soup and reimagined them as a composed plate. Caramelized onions were transformed into a silky puree, and a crispy onion chip. The rich beef broth became a consommé that was crystal clear and intensely flavored. The Gruyere cheese was incorporated as a delicate foam and as crispy tuile. The traditional bread component was reimagined as a tiny brioche crouton, with the texture of a perfect croissant. The dish required considerable technical skill to execute properly, but it also carried emotional weight that went beyond technique. Every time I prepared it, I was taking something that had been used as evidence of my inadequacy and transforming it into proof of my mastery. The soup that had supposedly lacked salt, that had been the excuse for public humiliation, had become in my hands a sophisticated composition that demonstrated exactly how far I had traveled from that moment of shame. I presented this dish to Chef Dubois during an elective session where students could showcase personal projects. He tasted it carefully, taking time to experience each component and to understand how they work together. His feedback was characteristically direct. The technical execution was sound, and the flavors were well balanced. However, he noted that the dish was perhaps too clever, too focused on deconstructing and reimagining at the expense of the emotional comfort that made the original so beloved. He suggested that the best reinterpretations honored the soul of the original dish while adding new dimensions, rather than completely transforming it into something unrecognizable. This criticism stung initially because I had invested considerable effort and emotion into developing the dish. Yet as I reflected on his comments, I recognized the truth in what he was saying. I had been so focused on proving my sophistication and skill that I had lost sight of what made food meaningful beyond technical perfection. The original French onion soup was beloved not because it was technically complex, but because it was deeply comforting. A bowl of warmth and richness that satisfied both hunger and the human need for nourishment that went beyond mere calories. I went back to the dish and reworked it, this time keeping the fundamental soul of French onion soup intact while adding refinements that elevated without transforming. The result was a version that looked traditional but revealed unexpected depths of flavor upon tasting, with the onions caramelized longer than standard recipes specified, with the broth built on roasted bones that had been aged to concentrate their flavor, with bread that was house-made and toasted to perfect crispness, with cheese that was carefully selected for optimal melting and flavor contribution. The dish was still recognizably French onion soup, but it was the best possible expression of that classic preparation. When I presented this revised version to Chef Dubois, his response was simply to nod and say that I was learning to balance ambition with wisdom, innovation with respect for tradition. He said that this balance was what separated good cooks from great chefs, and that I was beginning to understand the difference. The semester culminated in final examinations that tested everything we had learned across all the rotations. Each student had to plan and execute a complete 3-course meal that demonstrated mastery of multiple techniques, proper timing and coordination, and the ability to work at professional speed and precision. We were given a budget for ingredients, a time limit for execution, and a panel of 3 evaluating chefs who would judge every aspect of our performance from mise en place organization to final plating. I designed a menu that showcased the skills I had developed most thoroughly, while remaining within my technical capabilities. The first course was a composed salad featuring seared duck breast, roasted beets, candied walnuts, and a blood orange vinaigrette, demonstrating knife skills, protein cookery, and flavor balancing. The main course centered on pan-roasted halibut with a leek and potato puree, braised fennel, and a shellfish nage, showing my ability to work with delicate fish and to create complex sauces. The dessert was a dark chocolate soufflé with vanilla crème anglaise, perhaps the most technically demanding item on the menu, but one that I had practiced extensively and felt confident executing. The examination itself was 4 hours of sustained focus and precision. I moved through my timeline methodically, completing each task before moving to the next, building components that would later be assembled into finished dishes. The evaluating chefs circulated through the kitchen observing our work, occasionally asking questions about our choices or our techniques, their expressions neutral and revealing nothing about their assessments. When the time expired and I plated my final course, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the eventual grades I would receive. I had executed my plan effectively, demonstrated the techniques I had spent months mastering, and created food that represented my current capabilities honestly. The dishes on those plates were evidence of transformation, proof that the scared young woman who had left her family's catering business 18 months ago had developed into someone who could work at professional levels in serious kitchens. The examination results were posted 1 week later. I had received scores that placed me in the top 10% of my class, with particular recognition for organization, timing, and flavor development. One evaluator commented that my food showed maturity and restraint, that I was not trying to do too much but rather executing fundamental techniques at a high level. Another noted that my plating had improved significantly from earlier in the semester. The third simply wrote that the soufflé was perfect, which coming from a French pastry chef was perhaps the highest compliment possible. With the completion of the second semester, I had reached the midpoint of the associate degree program. I had survived 8 months of intensive culinary education that had tested every aspect of my capability and commitment. I had developed skills that would allow me to work in professional kitchens, and more importantly, I had developed the confidence and judgment necessary to continue learning and improving throughout my career. As I prepared for the summer break, I faced a decision about how to use the 3 months before the final year of the program would begin. I could return to catering work to rebuild my depleted savings, or I could pursue an externship at a restaurant where I could gain real-world experience in a professional kitchen. The externship would pay little or nothing, but it would provide learning opportunities that could not be replicated in a school environment. I chose the externship, accepting a position at a highly regarded restaurant that specialized in modern American cuisine with French technique. The decision meant I would be financially strained throughout the summer, but I was learning that the most valuable investments were often those that cost the most in the short term while paying dividends that accumulated over a lifetime. I was no longer making decisions based purely on immediate survival, but rather on building toward the future I was determined to create. The externship at Meridian began on a Monday morning in June when I presented myself at the restaurant's back entrance at 7 o'clock, wearing my chef's whites and carrying my knife kit with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that I had learned to recognize as the feeling that preceded significant growth. Meridian had earned considerable acclaim in the 3 years since opening, receiving praise from critics for its innovative approach to seasonal American cuisine and its commitment to sourcing ingredients from local farms and producers. The chef and owner, a woman named Sarah Chan, had worked in some of the most prestigious kitchens in New York and San Francisco before returning to her hometown to open a restaurant that reflected her own culinary vision. The kitchen I entered that first morning was significantly larger and more complex than anything I had experienced during culinary school. Multiple stations were operating simultaneously, each focused on different aspects of preparation for the evening service. The garde manger station handled cold appetizers and salads. The fish station managed all seafood preparations. The meat station was responsible for proteins cooked to order. The pastry station operated somewhat independently, producing the desserts and bread that supported the rest of the menu. At the center of this organized chaos was the pass, where Chef Sarah stood during service, inspecting every plate before it left the kitchen and orchestrating the timing that ensured all components of multi-course meals arrived at tables in proper sequence. I was assigned to start at the garde manger station under the supervision of a sous chef named Michael, who had been working at Meridian since it opened and who possessed the kind of efficient mastery that came from preparing the same dishes hundreds of times while maintaining standards that never wavered. He explained that my role during the externship would be to support the station's production, handling preparatory work during the day, and assisting with plating during service. I would not be cooking on the line initially, as that responsibility required familiarity with the restaurant systems and recipes that could only come from sustained experience. The work began immediately with no gentle introduction or orientation period. Michael handed me a case of heirloom tomatoes and instructed me to prepare them for the evening's tomato salad, a signature dish that appeared simple but required meticulous attention to detail. Each tomato needed to be examined and selected for optimal ripeness and visual appeal. They had to be sliced to precise thickness, arranged on plates in compositions that were both aesthetically pleasing and practically engineered to ensure each bite contained the proper ratio of tomato to accompanying elements. The process required speed without sacrificing precision, as we needed to prepare components for potentially 150 covers during the evening service. I worked through that case of tomatoes with complete concentration, finding a rhythm that allowed me to move quickly while maintaining the standards Michael demonstrated. He corrected my technique periodically, showing me how to angle the knife differently to achieve cleaner cuts, how to arrange the slices in patterns that looked natural rather than contrived, how to handle the delicate fruit without bruising it or compromising its structure. His corrections were direct and specific, focused entirely on improving the work rather than on judging me personally. As the day progressed, I rotated through various preparatory tasks that supported the garde manger station's evening service. I picked herbs from massive quantities of fresh basil and cilantro, removing each leaf from its stem and inspecting for any imperfections that would be visible on the plate. I prepared vinaigrettes according to recipes that were measured by ratio rather than specific quantities, learning to adjust acidity and seasoning by taste rather than formula. I portioned cheese and charcuterie for the restaurant's composed boards, slicing each element to the thickness that Michael specified and arranging them with spacing that looked abundant without being wasteful. The afternoon brought a staff meeting where the entire kitchen team gathered to discuss the evening's reservations and any special requests or dietary restrictions that would require menu modifications. Chef Sarah ran this meeting with brisk efficiency, communicating the information that each station needed, while soliciting questions or concerns that might affect service. She acknowledged my presence briefly, welcoming me to the team and expressing expectation that I would work hard and learn everything I could during the externship. There was no elaborate introduction or special accommodation for my student status. I was simply another member of the kitchen brigade, expected to perform my assigned role competently. Evening service began at 5:30 when the first orders started appearing on the kitchen's ticket system. The energy in the kitchen transformed immediately from the focused preparation of the afternoon into something more intense and urgent. Orders came in rapid succession, each one requiring coordination among multiple stations to ensure that all components of a table's meal were completed simultaneously and sent to the dining room together. I watched Michael work the garde manger station with impressive efficiency, assembling salads and cold appetizers with movements so practiced they appeared almost automatic, plating each dish to match the precise specifications that Meridian maintained for consistency. My role during that first service was limited to supporting Michael's work by ensuring he had properly portioned components readily available, and by handling the simpler plating tasks that did not require the speed or precision he brought to more complex dishes. I quickly discovered that working during actual restaurant service bore little resemblance to the controlled environment of culinary school kitchens. The pressure was relentless, the pace was unforgiving, and there was absolutely no tolerance for error or hesitation. Every plate that left the station would be scrutinized by Chef Sarah at the pass, and anything that failed to meet her standards would be rejected and remade, creating delays that could cascade through the entire kitchen's timing. During a particularly intense period when tickets were arriving faster than seemed manageable, I made my first significant error. I plated a salad with the dressing applied too heavily, obscuring the carefully arranged vegetables beneath a pool of vinaigrette. Michael caught the mistake before the plate reached the pass, but his reaction made clear the seriousness of the error. He told me sharply that we did not send imperfect food to guests regardless of how busy we were, that every plate represented the restaurant's reputation and our commitment to excellence. He instructed me to remake the salad completely, and I did so with shaking hands, hyper-aware that I had demonstrated exactly the kind of carelessness that could not be tolerated in professional kitchens. That first service lasted until nearly 11 o'clock when the final orders were completed and the kitchen could begin the extensive cleaning and preparation for the following day. I helped break down the guard manger station, storing unused components properly, sanitizing all work surfaces, and organizing the station so that the morning prep cook would find everything in order. By the time I left the restaurant after midnight, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. The sustained intensity of professional service had revealed how much I still had to learn about working at the speed and precision that real restaurants demanded. I continued at Meridian throughout that summer, working 6 days each week and gradually developing the stamina and skills that professional cooking required. The learning curve was steep and humbling, with each week bringing new challenges that tested my capabilities. I advanced from simple preparatory tasks to more complex responsibilities, as Michael determined that I could handle them reliably. I learned to work the guard manger station during lunch service when the volume was lower and the pressure was more manageable. I began to understand the rhythm of restaurant work, the way that preparation during quiet periods enabled performance during busy ones, the importance of organization and cleanliness in maintaining efficiency under pressure. Chef Sarah maintained high visibility in the kitchen, working the pass during every service and often stepping in at various stations when volume overwhelmed the assigned cooks, or when she wanted to demonstrate a particular technique. She was demanding in ways that reminded me of the best instructors at culinary school, expecting excellence without accepting excuses, but also providing clear guidance about how to achieve the standards she required. I observed her carefully during those months, learning not just cooking techniques but also leadership approaches, and the systems thinking that allowed a complex restaurant operation to function smoothly. One evening during a particularly challenging service, the chef working the fish station became ill midway through dinner and had to leave abruptly. Chef Sarah made a quick assessment of available resources and made a decision that both terrified and thrilled me. She moved Michael from guard manger to cover the fish station and assigned me to run guard manger independently for the remainder of service. This was not a vote of confidence in my abilities but rather a practical necessity born from limited options. However, it represented an opportunity to prove that I could perform under genuine pressure. The next 2 hours tested every skill I had developed during my time at Meridian and during culinary school. Orders continued arriving at a steady pace, and I had to prepare and plate each dish to the restaurant's exact specifications while maintaining the timing that allowed the kitchen to function as a coordinated unit. I made mistakes and Chef Sarah rejected several plates that failed to meet standards, but I learned to recover quickly from errors and to maintain focus despite the stress. By the time service ended and the kitchen could finally stand down, I had successfully managed a station during a busy service, and while my performance had not been perfect, it had been adequate. Chef Sarah called me aside after that service to provide feedback on my performance. She noted the errors I had made and the areas where my execution had been slower than necessary. However, she also acknowledged that I had maintained composure under pressure, and that I had been willing to attempt something difficult, rather than asking to be excused from the challenge. She said that this willingness to embrace discomfort and risk failure was essential for growth in professional cooking, and that many talented cooks never reached their potential because they avoided situations where their limitations might be exposed. This conversation marked a shift in my relationship with Chef Sarah and in my role at the restaurant. She began to see me as someone with potential rather than simply as an extern filling a temporary position. She started providing more direct mentorship, calling me over during service to observe particular techniques or to explain the reasoning behind certain preparations. She allowed me to attend the weekly menu planning meetings where the kitchen leadership discussed new dishes and seasonal adjustments, exposing me to the creative and business thinking that informed the restaurant's direction. As summer progressed into early fall and my time at Meridian approached its conclusion, I found myself reflecting on how much I had learned during those intense months. The technical skills I had developed were significant, with my knife work becoming faster and more precise, my understanding of flavor combinations becoming more sophisticated, and my ability to work under pressure improving substantially. However, the more important lessons were about the nature of professional cooking as a career and about the kind of chef I wanted to become. I had observed two distinct leadership styles during my time in professional kitchens. There were chefs who led through intimidation and dominance, who maintained control by keeping their staff in a constant state of anxiety about making mistakes. These kitchens were often technically proficient, but they were also toxic environments where creativity was suppressed, and where staff turnover was high because talented cooks eventually burned out or sought healthier work environments. Then there were chefs like Sarah Chun who led through clear standards and genuine mentorship, who demanded excellence but also invested in developing their staff's capabilities. These kitchens tended to be both technically excellent and creatively vibrant, attracting talented cooks who stayed for years because they were learning and growing. I knew with absolute certainty which type of chef I wanted to be. If I ever had the opportunity to lead my own kitchen, I would build an environment based on high standards and mutual respect, rather than fear and subordination. I would invest in developing my staff's abilities rather than simply extracting their labor. I would create a culture where people could take risks and learn from failures, rather than hiding mistakes to avoid punishment. This vision of leadership had been shaped by my experiences with mentors like Antonio Russo and Sarah Chun, who had shown me that excellence and humanity were not contradictory, but rather mutually reinforcing. On my final day at Meridian, Chef Sarah asked me to stay after service for a conversation. We sat in the quiet dining room after the last guests had departed and the kitchen had been cleaned and prepared for the following day. She told me that she had been impressed with my growth during the externship and with the work ethic and attitude I had demonstrated. She said that she would be happy to provide a reference for future opportunities, and that if I was interested in returning to work at Meridian after completing culinary school, there would be a position available for me. This offer represented exactly the kind of opportunity that most culinary students hoped for after graduation, a guaranteed position at a respected restaurant where I could continue developing my skills under excellent leadership. I thanked Chef Sarah sincerely for the offer and for the mentorship she had provided during the summer. I also told her honestly that I appreciated the option, but that I was not yet certain what direction I wanted to pursue after finishing my degree. I had begun to develop a vision for opening my own restaurant eventually, though I recognized that I would need several more years of experience and considerably more capital before that dream could become reality. Chef Sarah smiled at this admission and said that she had suspected I had ambitions beyond working in someone else's kitchen. She told me that the best chefs were often those who had spent time working for others, but who ultimately needed to express their own vision rather than executing someone else's. She encouraged me to continue seeking diverse experiences after graduation, to work in different types of restaurants and to learn from multiple mentors before committing to a particular direction. She said that the years I spent developing my skills and understanding would be an investment that would pay dividends throughout my career. As I returned to culinary school for the final year of my program, I carried with me the lessons and experiences from that summer at Meridian. I had discovered that I possessed the stamina and mental resilience necessary to work in demanding professional kitchens. I had developed technical skills that placed me ahead of many of my classmates who had not had similar real-world experience. Most importantly, I had gained clarity about the kind of career I wanted to build and the values I wanted that career to reflect. The final year of culinary school would focus on advanced techniques and on the business aspects of restaurant operations, preparing students to move from working in kitchens to potentially running them. I approached this final phase of my formal education with renewed focus and purpose, understanding that every class and every assignment was contributing to capabilities I would need when I eventually pursued my dream of opening my own establishment. I had traveled an enormous distance from the young woman who had been slapped at her sister's engagement party for supposedly making unsalted soup. That version of myself had believed her worth was determined by her family's assessment, and that questioning their judgment was evidence of ingratitude or arrogance. The person I had become understood that worth was demonstrated through actions and developed through sustained effort, that criticism from people who did not have your best interests at heart could be ignored, and that the only approval that ultimately mattered was the respect you earned from people whose standards were worth meeting. The journey was far from complete, but I was no longer taking steps forward with uncertainty and fear. I was moving with purpose and conviction, building toward a future that I was creating through daily choices and sustained commitment to becoming the chef and the person I wanted to be. The final year of culinary school began with a seminar on restaurant business fundamentals, a course designed to transform students from skilled cooks into professionals who understood the economic realities and operational complexities of running successful food establishments. The instructor was a veteran restaurateur named David Park who had opened and operated 4 different concepts over a 30-year career, experiencing both spectacular successes and costly failures that had taught him the hard lessons that could only be learned through direct experience. David began the course with a sobering statistic that he repeated throughout the semester. Approximately 60% of restaurants failed within their first year of operation, and 80% failed within 5 years. These failures were rarely due to poor cooking or lack of culinary talent. Instead, they resulted from inadequate capitalization, poor location selection, unrealistic projections about customer volume, failure to control costs, inadequate marketing, or simple exhaustion when owners discovered that running a restaurant required working 100 hours per week with no days off and minimal financial return during the critical early years. He told us that anyone who wanted to open a restaurant needed to understand that they were not primarily becoming chefs, but rather becoming entrepreneurs who happened to work in food service. The cooking was important, but it represented perhaps 20% of what determined success or failure. The other 80% involved site selection, lease negotiation, equipment procurement, staff recruitment and retention, inventory management, cost control, pricing strategy, marketing, customer service, and the dozens of other business functions that restaurants required to remain viable. This reality check was intentionally designed to discourage students who harbored romantic notions about restaurant ownership without understanding the practical demands involved. For me, the information had the opposite effect. I had already experienced the unglamorous reality of long hours and physical exhaustion through my work at the family catering business and through my externship at Meridian. I understood that building something significant required sacrifice and sustained effort over extended periods. What I needed now was not motivation but rather specific knowledge about how to translate culinary skills and vision into a sustainable business model. I approached the business course with the same intensity one had brought to technical cooking classes, recognizing that this knowledge would be equally important when I eventually pursued opening my own restaurant. I studied financial statements and learned to interpret the metrics that revealed whether a restaurant was truly profitable or simply generating revenue while losing money on operations. I analyzed case studies of successful restaurant concepts, identifying the common factors that contributed to their sustainability. I practiced creating business plans that forced me to think through every aspect of a hypothetical restaurant from initial concept through the first 3 years of operation. One assignment required each student to develop a complete business plan for a restaurant concept of their own design, including market analysis, financial projections, menu development, staffing plans, and marketing strategy. This project would be presented to a panel of industry professionals who would evaluate the viability of our proposals and provide feedback on strengths and weaknesses. The assignment represented an opportunity to begin transforming my vague aspirations about restaurant ownership into a concrete plan that could actually be executed. I spent weeks developing my concept, working through multiple iterations as I refined my vision and tested my assumptions against research and analysis. The restaurant I designed was called Gather, a name that reflected my belief that the most meaningful dining experiences were about bringing people together rather than simply feeding them. The concept focused on seasonal American cuisine with strong European technique, emphasizing locally sourced ingredients and preparations that honored traditional methods while incorporating contemporary sensibilities. The financial model I developed was intentionally conservative, assuming lower customer volumes and higher costs than optimistic projections might suggest. I had watched too many businesses fail because founders had based their plans on best-case scenarios that rarely materialized in reality. My projections assumed it would take 18 months to reach consistent profitability, and I built in substantial cash reserves to sustain operations through that critical period. The site I proposed was in an emerging neighborhood where rents were still affordable, but where demographic trends suggested increasing concentration of the young professionals and food enthusiasts who would comprise my target market. The menu I designed reflected everything I had learned about balancing creativity with accessibility, innovation with comfort. Each dish would tell a story about seasonal ingredients and traditional techniques, while offering something unexpected that would make the experience memorable. The wine program would focus on small producers and unusual varietals that would appeal to adventurous drinkers, while remaining approachable for casual diners. The service model emphasized warmth and genuine hospitality over formal protocol, creating an atmosphere where guests felt welcomed rather than intimidated. When I presented this business plan to the evaluation panel, I felt a level of nervous anticipation that exceeded what I had experienced during any culinary examination. This was not just an academic exercise but rather the preliminary blueprint for what I genuinely hoped to build once I had accumulated sufficient experience and capital. The panel asked challenging questions about my assumptions, my target market, my competitive positioning, and my contingency plans for various scenarios that could threaten the restaurant's viability. Their feedback was both encouraging and sobering. They felt the concept was sound and that my financial projections demonstrated appropriate caution rather than unrealistic optimism. However, they noted that I was significantly underestimating the capital required for build-out and equipment, that my timeline for reaching profitability was probably optimistic despite my conservative approach, and that I would need substantially more cash reserves than I had projected to weather the inevitable challenges that would arise during the first 2 years. One panelist estimated that I would need a minimum of $400,000 in total capitalization to execute the concept as I had designed it, a sum that seemed impossibly large given my current financial position. Despite these sobering realities, the exercise of developing a complete business plan had crystallized my vision in ways that abstract dreaming never could have achieved. I now had a concrete blueprint that I could refine and improve as I gained more experience and knowledge. I understood the specific challenges I would need to overcome, and the resources I would need to accumulate before attempting to open my own establishment. Most importantly, I had tested my concept against the scrutiny of experienced professionals, and learned that the fundamental vision was viable even if the execution would be more difficult and expensive than I had initially imagined. While the business course provided crucial knowledge about restaurant operations, the final year also included advanced culinary rotations that continued to develop my technical capabilities. I spent 6 weeks in an intensive pastry program that transformed my rudimentary understanding of baking into genuine competence with both classical preparations and contemporary dessert concepts. I learned to work with sugar at various temperatures, creating everything from delicate spun sugar decorations to hard caramel that could be shaped and molded. I mastered laminated doughs that produced croissants and puff pastry, with the precise number of buttery layers that distinguished excellent execution from merely adequate work. The pastry rotation proved unexpectedly valuable, not just for the technical skills it developed but also for the discipline it reinforced. Baking required absolute precision in measurement and timing that savory cooking could sometimes approximate rather than require exactly. A sauce could be adjusted during preparation if the seasoning was slightly off, or if the consistency needed modification. A cake that was overbaked or underseasoned could not be corrected after the fact. This unforgiving nature of pastry work taught patience and attention to detail that transferred to all other areas of cooking. I also completed a rotation in advanced butchery and charcuterie, learning to break down whole animals into their component cuts, and to transform lesser cuts into cured meats and pâtés that converted inexpensive ingredients into premium products. This knowledge had practical implications for restaurant economics, as the ability to purchase whole animals and fabricate them in-house could significantly reduce protein costs, while also providing creative opportunities to use every part and minimize waste. I learned to make tranches and rillettes, to cure bacon and pancetta, to prepare confit and to age whole prosciutto legs in controlled environments that developed complex flavors over months of patient waiting. During this final year, I maintained my connection with my study group from the earlier semesters, and we began discussing our plans for after graduation with increasing specificity and seriousness. Marcus had accepted a position as a line cook at a restaurant in Chicago that was known for its rigorous training program and its track record of developing cooks who went on to significant careers. Priya had been offered a pastry position at a boutique hotel that would allow her to develop her skills while working reasonable hours that would permit some balance between career and personal life. James was planning to stage at several high-end restaurants in Europe, using savings he had accumulated during his corporate career to fund an extended period of unpaid learning in Michelin-starred kitchens. My own plans were less defined but were beginning to take shape through the combination of the business planning work I had completed and the clarity I had gained about the kind of experience I would need before attempting to open my own restaurant. I decided that after graduation, I would spend at least 3 years working in professional kitchens at restaurants that represented excellence in different aspects of restaurant operations. I wanted to work at a restaurant known for impeccable technique and classical preparation. I wanted experience at a restaurant that was pushing creative boundaries and innovating in ways that challenged conventional approaches. I wanted to work at a small establishment where I could see every aspect of operations and understand how successful restaurants managed the business side of food service. This plan would require geographic flexibility and financial sacrifice, as the best learning opportunities were rarely the best paying positions. However, I had already demonstrated my willingness to prioritize long-term growth over short-term security. I was building a foundation that would support an entire career rather than simply seeking the most immediately comfortable situation available. As graduation approached, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone during the 2 years since walking out of my parents' house after being slapped at Victoria's engagement party. I had arrived at culinary school with technical competence developed through years of catering work, but with limited understanding of professional cooking at serious levels. I had possessed passion and determination, but had lacked the confidence that comes from having proven your capabilities against rigorous standards. I had harbored dreams about opening a restaurant someday, but had no concrete plan or realistic understanding of what that would require. The person preparing to graduate from culinary school was fundamentally different in ways that went beyond the obvious accumulation of skills and knowledge. I had developed genuine mastery of core techniques that would allow me to work in professional kitchens at any level. I had built relationships with mentors who had invested in my development and who would continue to provide guidance and support throughout my career. I had created a detailed business plan for the restaurant I wanted to open and had gained realistic understanding of the challenges I would need to overcome to make that vision a reality. Most importantly, I had developed unshakable confidence in my own judgment and abilities, no longer requiring external validation to know my worth. The graduation ceremony itself was a relatively simple affair, with the program director offering brief remarks about the challenges we had overcome and the careers we were preparing to begin. As I walked across the stage to receive my degree, I thought about all the people who had contributed to making this moment possible. I thought about Jessica, who had offered her couch when I had nowhere else to go, and who had provided unwavering support during the most difficult transitions. I thought about Antonio Russo, who had given me my first job after leaving my family, and who had shown me what mentorship looked like when it was based on genuine care rather than exploitation. I thought about Chef Sarah Chan, who had pushed me to attempt things I did not think I was ready for, and who had demonstrated what leadership looked like when it combined high standards with human decency. I also thought, inevitably, about my family. 2 years had passed since I had walked out of their house, and in that time there had been no contact whatsoever. I had occasionally checked their social media presence in moments of weakness, observing from a distance as Victoria documented her seemingly perfect life, and as my parents continued operating their catering business with no acknowledgement that I had ever been part of that world. The complete silence had been painful initially, but over time, it had become simply a fact of my reality that I had integrated and moved beyond. What struck me as I stood among my graduating classmates was the recognition that I no longer needed my family's acknowledgement or approval. I had built a life and a career trajectory based on my own vision and sustained by my own effort. I had proven to myself and to others whose judgment I respected that I possessed genuine talent and capability. The Elena who had needed her parents to recognize her worth had been replaced by someone who generated her own sense of value through actions and accomplishments that spoke for themselves. After the graduation ceremony concluded, I gathered with my study group to celebrate the completion of our program and to acknowledge what we had achieved together. We had supported each other through countless challenges, shared knowledge and resources when individual understanding fell short, and provided emotional sustenance during the moments when the difficulty of the program made continuation feel impossible. The friendships we had formed would continue beyond culinary school, providing a network of peers who understood the unique demands and rewards of professional cooking. As we sat together that evening sharing a meal we had prepared collectively, using the skills we had spent 2 years developing, James raised a toast to the future we were all stepping toward. He said that we had chosen one of the most difficult and least financially rewarding careers available to educated professionals, that we would work longer hours for less money than almost any other field we could have pursued, and that we had made this choice with full awareness of what it would cost us. He said that this made us either incredibly foolish or incredibly brave, and that he preferred to believe we were the latter. I thought about this characterization as I prepared for the next phase of my journey. Was I brave or foolish to have walked away from the security of family and familiar patterns to pursue a vision that might never fully materialize? Was I demonstrating courage or simply delaying the inevitable recognition that my parents had been right when they dismissed my ambitions as unrealistic fantasy? These questions had no definitive answers, as the ultimate verdict would only emerge through years of sustained effort, and through outcomes that could not yet be predicted. What I knew with certainty was that I would rather spend my life attempting something difficult that mattered to me than succeed at something easy that left me feeling hollow and diminished. I had already experienced what it felt like to subordinate my authentic self to others' expectations, and I had discovered that no amount of security or approval could compensate for the slow death of living inauthentically. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them as someone who was fully committed to her chosen path, rather than as someone perpetually wondering what might have been possible if she had only been brave enough to try. The week after graduation, I began preparing for the next chapter. I had accepted a position at a restaurant in Portland that had earned recognition for its commitment to farm-to-table cuisine and its innovative approach to traditional preparations. The position would pay modestly, but would provide exactly the kind of learning environment I was seeking. I would be working under a chef who had trained in France and who maintained exacting standards, while also fostering a kitchen culture based on mutual respect rather than fear and intimidation. As I packed my belongings and prepared to relocate once again, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied stepping into new and uncertain territory. I was leaving behind the structure and support of culinary school to enter the professional world where my skills and judgment would be tested constantly, and where there would be no grades or formal evaluations to confirm my progress. I would need to prove myself entirely through the work itself, through my ability to perform consistently at high levels regardless of circumstances or conditions. I was ready for this challenge. More than ready, actually. I had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this transition, and I had developed both the technical capabilities and the mental resilience that professional cooking required. I understood that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, that building the kind of career I envisioned would require years of sustained effort, with no guarantee of ultimate success. However, I also understood that the attempt itself had value regardless of the outcome, that becoming the kind of person who pursued ambitious goals with full commitment was its own form of success independent of any external achievement. The real work was just beginning, but I had already proven to myself that I possessed the determination and capability to handle whatever challenges would come. I was no longer the uncertain young woman who had fled her family in shame and confusion. I was a trained professional with clear vision and tested abilities, ready to continue building toward the future. I had been creating one deliberate choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.